All right. So this is the first edition of Econ Salon right here. And we've got one question, so I think I'll get right into it. So the question is, what do you think of MMT in the Indian context? MMT is obviously modern monetary theory. Now I'll tell you something about MMT. Okay, what are the, to speak generally speaking, what is the basic thing that MMT is saying? MMT is saying that a government which issues its own currency and basically borrows in it and has a compliant central bank and allows the exchange rate to move freely can never become insolvent. Okay, in the sense that it can always issue new money to finance, to retire its older liabilities. That is correct. That is one of the things MMT says. Of course, MMT has a whole bunch of other things with it. MMT has grown out of, the University of Kansas City, Missouri kind of practices and stuff like that. It also has a lot of influence of Hyman P. Minsky, whom I hold in high regard. Now, as far as I'll say one thing about MMT is that it is best not to say such things explicitly. It is correct that sound finance doesn't really apply to a sovereign government. It applies definitely to a private entity, it applies to a sort of a local government or a state government, but it doesn't apply to a sovereign government. But it is best not done this way, because what can happen is if you explicitly start saying such things and you start using, say, only the fiscal side to control prices by using taxation instead of, having the monetary authority, that is the central bank, target an interest rate, or rather target an inflation rate and use the short-term interest rates as one lever, and of course now you target long-term rates as well. The problem with that is that, if people are not clear that as Minsky used to say, that government debt needs to be validated. Now this may seem like this is a sound finance perspective, but it isn't really. Government debt being validated as in it should be seen that the government is also at least going to follow something which resembles sound finance. It may not exactly be sound finance. So what should be done is, what should always be kept in mind is, it is important for the fiscal and the monetary authority to build credibility, and that paradoxically provides you with the space to do some of the things that MMT is prescribing. Because if you do otherwise, because if you a priori say that, it doesn't matter, government debt doesn't matter and we are going to be able to retire all our liabilities anyway with new money if required, then what happens is it could lead to a situation where expectations become unhinged. Okay, inflationary expectations, and people and the market starts rejecting both your fiat money as well as your government securities, and that is when hyperinflation can happen. Okay, the reason why the Weimar hyperinflation happened was because there was just the central bank that is of the Germany just bought the Reichsbank bought the government securities directly, sent money directly to the government, that is a primary market purchase basically, and that was spent immediately. So that is exactly the sort of dynamic that leads to a hyperinflation. On the other hand, if you resort to quantitative easing, as in say large scale secondary market purchases, etc., so on and so forth, right, that is something that will not create the same kind of issues. I'll get into it. So MMT is something that is best not brought out into the open. The kind of things that MMT prescribes can be built in even with the current configuration. Okay, Saurav Jha has a follow-on question. It says, what does India need to do to match the Chinese economy in a decade or two? India's economic gap is the greatest ever, 3.2 trillion versus 20. It's not exactly actually 20 trillion. And now with the yuan falling, it's not going to be anywhere near that number. In terms of nominal GDP, they are not 6 times our size. They are more like 5 times. And the yuan will fall soon. Of course, there will be some co-movement with the INR also. But that's not really the metric. But to catch up, it's simple. We need to basically kick off our private investment cycle. It's quite obvious what we need to do. We have been seeing a downturn in the investment cycle since 2013. We saw an investment cycle between 2004 and sort of 2012-13. We haven't seen that cycle pick up again for 9 years now. That is what we need to change. And obviously, we need to have manufacturing investment. We need to encourage investment in manufacturing. We need to obviously invest in services, and we need to fix agriculture. And for fixing agriculture, just passing 3 laws which have holes in them, which lead to problems, is not what I mean. Fixing agriculture will require all kinds of interventions. But at the same time, and it would also include bringing in the private sector, the non-farm private sector as well. That is there. But to think that just 3 laws would have fixed it is wrong. It won't work that way. So the 3 main things I think we need to do is, we need to first fix our infrastructure, because we have a disability of anything between 9% to 20% in terms of cost price in various sectors as far as China and Vietnam are concerned. This is narrowing, it needs to narrow further. I'll tell you something. In our country, logistics cost as a percentage fraction of GDP is very high. It has to be brought down to below 5%. Right? It has to be brought down to below 5% of GDP. That is the sort of logistics, share of GDP that our logistics expense should have. And for that, we need to build. And the infrastructure build-up will also crowd in investments, private investments. It will help kickstart the investment cycle. Many of the other reforms have actually been put in place which are required, like IPC, etc. and things like that. Those are good reforms. Those are things that will aid this process, because they are aiding the bank NPA cleanup process as well. Of course, the new bad bank has a lot of issues, and those will need to be fixed. Maybe I'll go into them in some other episode. So those are there. Now, as far as Raghuram Rajan's comments on PLI concerned, I don't agree with them. I think PLI schemes are required at this juncture because we have a window now. China, as you can see, people have understood that, the cost of disruption may outweigh the cost of the efficiency gains that you had from this distributed, made in the world kind of scenario. Even before the pandemic, manufacturing was getting regionalized for certain, for very important sectors. So we were starting to have these regional supply chains emerge in Mexico, and of course the biggest regional supply chain is RCEP. But we need one in the subcontinent, and we can draw in other countries in the subcontinent for that. PLI will help, but PLI has to be tweaked to include a major focus on basically components, subsystems, and that obviously means a focus on MSMEs. So new layers will have to be added, and a lot of work will have to be done on the industry academia side. Our small MSMEs, they require a lot of extension support from academia and institutes, and it should be done. And here, if we had a ministry of, say, something like MITI that Japan had, and now they have METI, basically a proper ministry of industry and technology that would have had bureaucrats and technocrats and other specialists doing just this and nothing else, which is identifying what needs to be indigenized, where value needs to be added, where foreign collaboration is required. Basically, micro interventions are required. You need something like that. That would have been useful. Okay, I'll go to another question. We have a thing in... Foxfinance on free trade agreements. I think the current sort of outlook on free trade agreements is the right one. It's best to pursue shallow free trade agreements right now, rather than join some omnibus, RCEP. That won't work. In any case, RCEP is flawed, and I've argued against that in the past as well. But shallow free trade agreements which sort of first build trust, and then you add new items, you add new layers. That's the sort of thing we should be looking at. And I think we are headed in that direction. Of course, but one thing is there. Rules of origin have to be looked at very carefully. Even the new FTA with UAE, the rules of origin will need to be tightened. See, because those FTAs and CEPAs and all that we have with East Asia, they have really not been useful for us to that extent. You have cases where, South Korea is dumping stuff on us which it does not make at all. South Korea, can you imagine that? And something quite low end. So that is the sort of thing which is going on, and we need to avoid that. Okay. Elron Skywalker asks, what is Econ Salon? Well, Econ Salon is not, is not analogous to indigenization appreciation hour, really. It's not. It's not just a case of my answering your questions. There'll be guests over here, there'll be background discussions. Then we'll have a proper salon kind of a setup where we'll have people talking, having freewheeling discussions with also comments and questions being taken on from the, from online viewers. That is what Econ Salon will be. This is just the first configuration, as I've called it. This is not really this is not really what it would be like going forward. Okay, next question. Yuvraj Singh asks, smartphone manufacturing has gone up, but other chipset industries are still missing. I want to buy an Xbox, buy Microsoft, Sony don't manufacture the consoles. Yeah, that's exactly right. So even the India's electronics industry needs to diversify in terms of products, and obviously in terms of, and needs to increase value addition. What I'm hearing is that apparently smartphone value addition is not stuck at 10-12% levels anymore. It's increasing, but it needs to increase. The other day there was this sort of figure put out by the government that they intend to reach this $300 billion figure for total value of industry, electronics output that is, by 2026. And 70 billion of that will be accounted for by semiconductors. So obviously that's a pretty large number and should be enough to incentivize investment in India. Of the kind of semiconductors we need. Of course, 5G phones will require, 5 nanometer node technology and less. So I don't think a 5 nanometer node plant is going to be set up in India in the next few years. So that is also there. But then, you have a higher node lengths which are suitable for many other things. Okay. We have another question here. We're coming in. Foxfin is again asking, there is talk of Tapi pipeline in the subcontinent feasible. This talk has been going on forever. At one time it seemed almost, that it might just get off the ground a little bit. The talk always used to be about Tapi versus, IPI and IPI. Those were the two things, because gas delivered by pipelines, depending on the distance, is actually more competitive than LNG. Again, depending on the distance. And Russia would have definitely wanted that Tapi pipeline. Well, let's see how it goes. You see, India and Pakistan have to come to some sort of an arrangement at some point in time. Because not only will Pakistan can definitely benefit greatly through closer economic ties with India, and so can India. But how things are at the moment. So that is one thing. But it's not completely ruled out, but doesn't look feasible for the time being. Okay. Another question is, Foxfin asks, economic integration in the subcontinent, Pakistan and Chinese influence hampering. I think it's Chinese influence and even American influence to an extent which is hampering it, more than Pakistani influence. Because when we talk about Pakistan, we should not only talk about the Pakistan army, the Pakistani people and the Pakistani business community and the Pakistani bureaucracy also matters. Unfortunately, the army seems to have a lock on foreign policy over there. And external players have a lock on the army. Okay, so it's the Pakistan army is the greatest, enemy of the Pakistani state itself. Actually, this is a strange thing to say, but this is exactly what is happening. In fact, if you look at Pakistani businessmen, I'm sure many of them want closer ties with India. So now, but look at it this way: closer integration with, say, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, and of course Nepal and Bhutan, can happen anyway. Obviously, if Pakistan is included in this mix, it would have been better, because Pakistan would have been a key transit point for many things to Central Asia and all. Say something produced in Bangladesh, or say a regional value chain which includes producers in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka and of course India, would then have been exported via the land route somewhere. Those were possibilities, but a small fraction. Ultimately, the amount of TEUs you can move via land pales in comparison by what you can move via sea. Okay, let's discuss a few more things. Let me come back to the sort of issue of MMT. By the way, this is an inaugural edition, and this is not going to go on for an hour. This is going to be around 30-35 minutes. Okay, because I'm just sort of rolling this out a little bit. This is not like IAH, as I said. This is not going to be like IAH. It's going to be very different. But we are going to take questions, obviously. Coming back to the issue of MMT and modern monetary theory, and why can't we just print our way out of trouble? It doesn't work like that. Even MMT recognizes that if you spend on basically what are called price inelastic sectors, then you will just end up in inflation and not with any growth in output. Right. In any case, the problem with both the fiscal and the monetary levers are, let's take the monetary lever. You can quell aggregate demand by increasing interest rates, but by lowering interest rates, you may not reduce unemployment. It's asymmetric. There a lot of micro level interventions are required. Same with fiscal policy. The direction of spending is the most important thing. I'll give you an example. When we are spending right now, if the government spending ends up helping the so-called advanced sectors of the economy, say like the IT sector and other advanced manufacturing sectors, it has been observed that the labor market for those particular sectors can become very tight, as in you may suddenly start facing shortages of labor, and that can drive up wages and prices and in various parts of the economy, because they could be heavy spenders. IT employees could be heavy spenders. So you could see a wage price spiral happening because of some sectors, and that would lead to the central bank raising interest rates to cut off aggregate demand, and you would have a suboptimal outcome again. Where there's a small burst of inflation, some people gain while most do not. Okay. So that is always the case. Problem with MMT is, MMT argues that you can use taxes more effectively than the interest rate lever. So they are basically telling the fiscal authority to control prices as well. It's not always so simple. In the future, when everybody has an account and money can be deducted directly from an account at will, although that cannot really happen, maybe, but still, I think the current setup where you have a fiscal authority and you have a monetary authority, as in a central bank, and you're using mainly interest rates, basically you're regulating the flow of liquidity in the economy, I think that is a better way to control prices right now. But this is of course discussable. I'll discuss this issue at length because this is a very important topic. As far as other things are concerned, as far as what we need to do in India, obviously the direction of fiscal spending has to improve considerably. We have, whether the central or the state governments, they have to get out of freebie mode. Money has to be directed towards infrastructure build-up. Money has to be directed towards creating capacities in key industries of the future. Obviously battery manufacturing capacity, battery storage, etc., semiconductors, so on and so forth. Beginnings have been made, but things have to move faster. Reforms in agriculture are definitely required, but they should be more consultative in nature and more gradual. Because you see, today what are we talking about? We are talking about how we are exporting wheat when wheat from Ukraine and all has stopped. And many countries are basically will be on the brink of starvation if it is not for wheat from elsewhere. Now this great wheat surplus has happened because of a system that we adopted. If we suddenly change this system, there is no guarantee that this surplus will suddenly not turn into a problematic deficit, which is why gradualism is required. So step by step, and I'm not talking about a 50-year process, I'm talking more about a 5 to 10-year process, and that needs to happen. Some more questions are coming in. Current economic health of India, Raghav asks, is it good, bad or ugly? It's not ugly anymore, but it's not very great. In the sense that the gains that were made in removing extreme poverty, those have been chipped away at by the pandemic. The major gains that you saw, although Surjit Bhalla and all have come out with a paper that is robust to the pandemic, I don't agree. Even anecdotally, you can see poverty having risen, say, on the streets of Delhi and other places. So this will be a matter of debate, and I talked to a lot of people in the countryside, and I went on a trip of Eastern India in December, and I went into the interiors and I talked to various people. Situation is not that good. What has happened is that wages are stagnant. I mean, nominal wages, while prices have increased. So they are not in a very good place. The real wages, which were in any case small to low to begin with, have declined. Which is why you're not seeing consumption strength in the Indian economy. So that has to change. We have to kickstart the private investment cycle. Things like the Pradhan Mantri Anna Yojana, I think it needs to be continued for a while longer. That will help. PM Kisan transfers will help. But fiscal spending cannot only be about transfers. It has to move towards the direction of spending has to go towards productivity and growth. So this infrastructure spending is going to be very, very important. Even now, what you're seeing is that, although MNREGA offtake from MNREGA has gone down from what happened during 2020, it is still higher than pre-pandemic levels. And that is a sign of distress in the labor market. That needs to change. We may have to bring in a new urban job guarantee program as well for a while, because there are lots of things that can be done in the urban areas which can actually help businesses and which will be manpower intensive, fixing things, doing things. So that is where we need to look at as well. It's not just a question of digging holes and filling them. A lot of good things can be done. Another thing is, because of demonetization, we had a lot of these MSMEs going out of business, and with it, and that contributed to the decline in manufacturing employment, along with the introduction of GST, obviously, which was envisioned. But those people are still around. So if we can get a manufacturing cycle sort of kick-started by tweaking PLI, by adding the layers I talked about, which are targeted at MSMEs, by creating proper industrial clusters, we may have a large pool of people who can be absorbed directly, and that will help Indian manufacturing. As far as India's macro fundamentals are concerned, they are all right. That is the silver lining in all of this. You know about our reserves. They are adequate for at least 8 months of imports. Also, our debt coverage ratios are very good. In any case, the Indian government hasn't taken on any real foreign debt. It's only 6% compared to 33% elsewhere. Dollar borrowings are minimal. So the macro fundamentals are in place, and those need to be maintained. And as far as inflation is concerned, of course, it's a concern, because the pandemic really hit supply chains and etc. And the tightening cycle should be gradual. It should not be rapid. Tightening has actually already begun. I'll explain that. You see, because with the introduction of what is called the special deposit facility, SDF, the RBI has actually already begun the tightening cycle. So inflation is a concern, but it will be brought under control. This is my view. Because of the turn towards flexible inflation targeting that happened since 2016. That was also a key reform that this government can claim that it brought in. And that is definitely something it did. But it needs to. But going forward, it needs to enhance the credibility of the RBI. That will help quell inflation. As far as growth is concerned, I have no doubt in my mind that our potential growth rate has gone down. Potential is the maximum possible rate at which we can grow without sparking of inflation. It is not 7% anymore, real GDP growth rate. It is probably around closer to 6%. And that needs to be enhanced. And again, infrastructure spending will help with that. And of course, spending on healthcare and on education. Education spending has been very poor in the last 10 years or so. Okay, we have more questions. We have a question from M. Anirudh asking, Raghuram Rajan overhyped or legit? Also has seen several economists like S. Gurumurthy defend demo with data. Your thoughts on the same? I can't defend demo. Raghuram Rajan is a good central banker. Some of the things he says are not wrong, but some of the other things he says are, like that. They are of a particular, they're a particular kind of view, I would say. Maybe more discussion and interrogation needs to happen over there. But on other things, as in, being an inflation hawk and all, that is fine. As when he was in the RBI, he did introduce things which were useful. As far as demonetization is concerned, see, it should never be done. There was a pools analysis. You would note one thing, that modern central banks do not target monetary aggregates, as in they do not target the amount of money in the economy. And there are various measures of money. There is base money, which is the central bank's own liabilities. There's M1, M2, M3. Broader, definitions of money are there, where you include currency and commercial bank reserves, and you add both checking and time deposits and, savings deposits, etc. So you do that. That is one measure. The point is that India was a cash-based economy. And in India, cash was used for lending. When the government removed 86% of cash in circulation, just like that, it basically gave India a monetary shock. Okay. It was exactly like a Volcker shock that happened in America, where the interest rate was suddenly pushed up to 20% to 12%. It was done using monetary aggregates. And that is not done anymore, because the relationship between monetary aggregates and prices and growth is very unstable. This is why central banks target an interest rate. Whereas in this case, the government acted like a central bank targeting the monetary aggregate, the amount of money in the economy, and just withdrew it suddenly offline. What do you think would have happened? Obviously, a fall in growth and unemployment. And that is what came to be. And that created a sort of structural weakness. It is okay to defend, and you're talking about I'll increase the tax rate and tax compliance, etc. Those are more longer term things. You do not screw your potential growth rate in the hope that you will have better tax compliance. And there are other reasons also for which tax compliance has increased. This is not the only reason. If you do a multivariate analysis, the contribution of this particular reason may not be as high as that of other reasons. So what has happened is, you justified demonetization saying something, and then when that didn't come to pass, whether in terms of currency, whether in terms of FICN, whether in terms of curbing the black economy, whether in terms of curbing terrorism, new excuses were tacked on, which is understandable because it became a political matter. But if you ask my opinion, I don't think this is something that should ever be done. And this should be the last. One more demonetization has been done in India before also, but those were done for a much smaller fraction of notes. And see, as happens with any such exercise, when you take away 86% of currency in circulation, then this is what happens. You cannot reflate the economy quick enough. Your ATMs are not ready. Even the supply of money is not ready really. So those are issues. And then what you did was, through demonetization, you stuffed the commercial banks with deposits. Right. So obviously the reserves also increase. But the environment was such that it wasn't conducive to lending. So all that the commercial banks did was use the reverse repo window of the RBI and lend to them. So it did not lead to the credit channel of banking getting fixed either, because that's not how things work. Anyway, next. Okay, logical song asks, how efficient is Indian farming compared to developed countries? What is the motivation for Indian farmers to invest in becoming more efficient? Obviously, you have to incentivize that, right? You have to provide them support. See, when you look at farming, if you've done your studies, you will find that as far as holding size is concerned, it is not true that holding size is a dominant factor for all crops. In fact, there are some crops where smaller holdings can be more productive also. There are many crops where large holding size leads to greater productivity, no doubt about that. But the point is that you need to, talk to farmers. You need to use the MSP mechanism to get them off some of the things where we are overproducing using a lot of water. We need to move them onto less thirsty crops. We need to move them onto cash crops, things like that, which are less thirsty, use less fertilizers. And about fertilizers, there has to be a massive push to have continuous dialogue with farmers, farmer collectives, farmer producing organizations, etc., as to what is happening. None of this can happen just by some broad law. That is exactly what I'm trying to say again and again. It requires micro level interventions. That is, the macro requires micro. The micro requires macro also. Obviously, you have to get the structure in place properly. So this is actually a very good question you're asking. How do you get it to do? See, it's very easy to criticize this government or to celebrate some government, but the fact is the actual running of a country and actual doing things is far more difficult. And that is what I try to say again and again. That there are things, we have broad perspectives, we have some perspectives at the micro level also, but we are ultimately, you, I, etc. cannot just do things just like that. We have to have all together with the government basically driving the matter. That is how things happen. Okay, Sharad Guru asks, what is your view on the coal crisis? Is there an influence of cronism that is being prioritized in FTAs and other economic relations with foreign countries? I don't know if there is cronism or not, but of course, like I said, rules of origin, we have to be careful with the FTAs, but shallow FTAs we should do, because it will also, an FTA, if not anything, it creates a sense, and not with the East Asians, because those FTAs just end up being ways to dump things on us. But FTAs with the West create a sense in those countries that this is the country you should look at for sourcing. So in that sense, the FTAs are not per se bad, but of course, the fine print has to be looked at. As coal crisis, you can see what is happening. We are supposed to become completely independent by 2030. It's not going to be so easy. And this is why I had been advocating nuclear for so long, but we all know where that went. So I'll say one thing, our manufacturing takeoff should not get truncated because of coal supply problems either. If required, we should get in coal from elsewhere, but obviously that has implications for the current account balance. So those that can be done. But yes, it is a concern. Okay, Logical Song asks, what does GDP growth rate need to be given population growth rate? Well, if you want your per capita income to increase at a steady clip, you need a GDP growth. You say you want your GDP growth rate to be, you want your per capita income growth rate to be 5%, and your population growth rate is 1.2%. Then obviously 6.2% is what your real GDP growth rate should be for real per capita income growth rate of 5%. That is the case. Unfortunately, just before the pandemic hit, Q4 growth rate was way below even potential. Right? So that is the thing. Okay, 007YMM asks, so what do you think ever even came up with the idea of demonetization? Who do you think? I really don't know. This is a question that, I can't answer. I really don't know who came up with it. But it could be that the PMO was misled. It could be. This is just my view. Okay. And it's a could be caveat. So, because it should not have been done. It's ridiculous. It should be only done in a cash-based economy which is seeing hyperinflation or is going to go towards hyperinflation. And that was not the case with India at that time. There was no need to give a huge monetary shock like this. So that is one thing. Okay. How did demonetization lead to IT layoffs? Not to IT layoffs so much, but MSME layoffs. IT layoffs, it led to only very, very small fraction because of the overall decline in demand. Because that is the fallacy of composition. Some people from the organized sector were saying, yeah, demonetization. This is going to screw the unorganized bastards who don't pay taxes once and for all. But you see, that was a mistake. The unorganized sector also accounted for overall demand in the economy. We screwed up aggregate demand, and that led to weakness in various sectors. But it mainly screwed the small MSME manufacturing sector. That is what it really dented. The small calls and karkhanas which hired 10 people, 15 people, 20 people, they were very badly hit. And people in agriculture were also badly hit because all lending was cash based over there, except of course micro lending and all that. Then another question. Then micro lending is cash based in many places. Okay. Then we have a question by Logical Song. Where can we find job numbers by sector? As far as, you have various. If you want overall job numbers, number sectors, NSSO, etc., you can find it there, MOSPI. I'll give a bunch of links later. And as far as the impact of demonetization of jobs, there are various studies. One study from Azim Premji Foundation says up to 5 million jobs may have been lost. The number of jobs lost was significant because I have talked to a lot of people, and even anecdotally what I've heard is not very promising. Okay, next question here is Logical Song says amateur competition beats efficiency, not subsidies. It's only when it is actual competition. But what happens is you may end up in a situation where, in the name of competition, you destabilize the sector, and then the remaining private players end up receiving subsidies. So you end up privatizing profits and socializing costs. That also happens. It is already happening. Many people who take over airports then want the same kind of subsidies that AAI was giving. Okay, Gabbar RF asks, this is my last question. How long can the union fund bankrupt states, and does funding them incentivize this behavior? Obviously, there is a question of moral hazard if you keep bailing out people. And the thing is that states will have to tighten spending, which is why a fiscal council is required. And a fiscal council needs to look at every state to basically change the direction of spending and come back onto a intertemporally sustainable path. Because the state government has to pursue sound finance. It cannot pursue what is called functional finance, as say MMT is advocating. A sovereign government can, but even a sovereign government which needs to import things from elsewhere won't be able to do it because of the exchange rate, which will just go into oblivion, and you will import inflation via that. Okay, Logical Science, would you say India has recovered from the demonetization shock by now? This is my last thing. Only to an extent, not fully. And then we had another shock because you see, demonetization was a deflationary shock. Then you had GST, which was an inflationary shock for various sectors. Okay, so you had a shock where demonetization destroyed aggregate demand, and then you had some supply side inflation coming in from GST. So this was a double whammy for many small companies. They couldn't pass on prices because of the overall level of aggregate demand, and yet their supply input cost pressure increased, and they couldn't get the input tax rebates on time either because of the problems with the GST, with the IT mechanism supporting GST. So those things all need to be fixed. In fact, GST needs to be fixed. GST can be a great strength for India and a driver of growth, but it needs to be implemented properly. It needs to be fixed. Right now, if you have a go down in one state and you have a factory in another state, you will need GST registration in both those states. Okay, if you are somebody selling biscuits all over India, the likelihood is you will need GST registration in all states of India. Right, and so this is not how it should be. There should be only one point of GST registration. That's it. Okay, and there are many other things that can be changed. Vijay Kelkar has a lot of good suggestions. They should be adhered to. Anyway, this was just an inaugural session. We'll have more value-added component here. I'm sort of signing off now. I said it would be only for 35 minutes. See you sometime in the future. Right, bye.